In the summer of 1866, 15,000 Chinese laborers were carving the Central Pacific Railroad through the Sierra Nevada. They were laying track at the rate of 1 mile per day. And then they hit the canyon at Cape Horn. 2,000 feet of granite cliff falling straight down to the American River. No place to lay track. No way around the mountain. What they built is what kept the railroad moving. A wooden trestle bridge clinging to the side of a granite wall, 1,000 feet long and 100 feet tall, made entirely of timber cut from the surrounding forest. Workers were lowered from the cliff face in wicker baskets to set the first charges. The men who did it were paid $30 a month, less than half what white laborers earned. Some of the original chisel marks are still visible in the rock today. This is how they built it. To understand what the Central Pacific was up against in the Sierra Nevada, you need to understand the geography first. Sacramento sits at about 30 feet above sea level, a flat river town surrounded by farmland. Donner Pass, where the railroad had to cross the Sierra Crest, sits at 7,056 feet. That is a vertical climb of over 7,000 feet in roughly 100 miles of track. And the terrain between those 2 points is not a gentle slope. It is a wall of granite, fractured by canyons, buried under snow for 6 months of the year, and cut by rivers that have been carving through rock since before human beings existed on this continent. The rock itself was the enemy. Sierra granite is among the hardest stone on the continent. It does not crumble under a chisel. It does not fracture cleanly under a hammer blow. It rings. It sends the shock back up through the steel and into the bones of the man holding it. Black powder, the only explosive available for most of the construction, barely dented it. A charge that would shatter limestone left Sierra granite scarred but standing. Later in the construction, the railroad experimented with nitroglycerin, a substance so unstable that it killed the men who handled it almost as often as it killed the rock. Workers mixed it on site, in the cold, with numb fingers. Theodore Judah, the railroad's original chief engineer, had surveyed the route before the Civil War. He walked it on foot. He hauled his surveying instruments on his back through passes that were snowbound 8 months of the year. He slept in the open. He mapped every ridge and ravine. And he concluded that the only feasible path across the Sierra ran through a series of granite cuts, tunnels, and trestle bridges that would push American engineering beyond anything it had attempted. Judah never saw his route built. He contracted typhoid fever while crossing the Isthmus of Panama in November of 1863 and died in New York 1 week later at 37 years old. The railroad he imagined would take 5 more years and 15,000 men to complete. But his survey survived, and it called for 15 tunnels carved through solid granite. The longest, tunnel number 6 at Donner Summit, would stretch 1,659 feet through rock so hard that black powder charges barely chipped it. Workers advanced the tunnel at the rate of roughly 1 foot per day, drilling by hand, blasting, clearing rubble in wheelbarrows, then drilling again. A foot a day, through granite, for over a year. The air inside the tunnel headings was nearly unbreathable. Black powder smoke had nowhere to go. The ventilation was whatever draft came through the bore. Workers emerged from their shifts covered in granite dust and powder residue, coughing, their eyes streaming. Charles Crocker, in a moment of either genius or desperation, ordered a vertical shaft sunk from above to meet the tunnel bore from the middle, effectively creating 4 working faces instead of 2. The shaft was 73 feet deep, driven straight down through granite, and the debris was hauled up by hand winch. It worked. Progress doubled. But the conditions inside did not improve. At one point, Crocker brought in a crew of Cornish miners from Virginia City, experienced hard rock men, to prove that white labor could outwork the Chinese. He put the Cornish on one face and the Chinese on the opposite face, and measured their progress every Sunday morning. The Chinese outmeasured the Cornish without exception, every single week. Crocker never repeated the experiment. The tunnels were only part of the problem. Between the tunnels were canyons, deep ones. Canyons carved by millennia of snowmelt and river erosion, their walls sheer granite, their floors 1,000 feet or more below the proposed rail line. The railroad could not go around them. It could not tunnel under them. The terrain simply did not permit it. It had to cross them. And in the 1860s, in a mountain range with no roads and no supply chain, that meant one thing: wood. Enormous structures made of wood. If you are watching this channel for the first time, consider subscribing. We cover the forgotten labor and engineering that built this country, told the way it deserves to be told. Now, the Central Pacific had a labor crisis long before it had an engineering crisis. When construction began in Sacramento in January of 1863, the company could barely field a crew. White laborers signed on, collected a few weeks of wages, and vanished into the gold fields of California or the silver mines of the Comstock Lode in Nevada. The turnover was relentless. Charles Crocker, the railroad's construction boss and one of the Big Four executives who controlled the Central Pacific, was desperate for a stable workforce. His superintendent of construction was James Harvey Strobridge, a hard and uncompromising man from Vermont. Strobridge had already lost his right eye to a premature black powder explosion at Bloomer Cut in July of 1864. 2 other workers were injured in that same blast. One of them, a Portuguese laborer, was not expected to survive. Strobridge drove himself and his men without mercy, but he could not drive men who refused to stay. Crocker proposed hiring Chinese laborers. Strobridge objected. He said they were too small, too frail, unsuited for heavy construction. Crocker reportedly replied that the Chinese had built the Great Wall. Whether that exchange actually happened or was embellished later, the decision was made. In February of 1865, 50 Chinese workers were hired on a trial basis. They proved themselves within days. The Chinese did not drink, they did not brawl in the camps at night, they did not disappear on payday. They organized themselves into crews of roughly 30 men under their own headmen and foremen. They cooked their own meals, mainly rice, dried fish, and vegetables. And they boiled their water for tea instead of drinking from streams, which meant they suffered far fewer intestinal illnesses than the white workers who drank unboiled water. They bathed and changed clothes regularly. They worked from sunrise to sunset without complaint, and the quality of their labor was immediately apparent. Crocker began recruiting thousands more, both from Chinese communities in California and directly from Guangdong Province in southern China. Ships carried workers across the Pacific to San Francisco, where they were transported by riverboat to Sacramento, and then by rail as far as the track extended. From there, they walked. They carried their bedrolls and their tools to the construction camps in the Sierra foothills, and they went to work. Most of these men came from farming villages in the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong. They were not engineers. They were not trained construction workers. They were farmers and fishermen who had left their families to cross an ocean because the economic conditions in southern China, devastated by the Taiping Rebellion and repeated famines, offered them no future. Many intended to work for a few years, save their wages, and return home. Most never did. They ranged in age from their mid-teens to their early 30s. They were small by American standards, averaging about 5 feet 4 inches and 120 pounds. Strobridge looked at them and saw weakness. Crocker looked at them and saw an army. The camps they lived in were organized by the workers themselves. Each crew of roughly 30 men shared a tent or a rough wooden bunkhouse. They appointed a cook who prepared meals over a communal fire. Their diet was dramatically different from the white workers. Instead of salt pork, beans, and whiskey, the Chinese ate rice, dried oysters, abalone, cuttlefish, bamboo shoots, mushrooms, and seaweed, most of it shipped from San Francisco by the Chinese provisioner Sisson, Wallace and Company, which held the exclusive contract to supply the Chinese camps. They drank boiled tea instead of raw water. They washed their clothes and bathed regularly. The result was measurable. The Chinese crews suffered far fewer cases of dysentery, scurvy, and general illness than the white crews. They lost fewer working days to sickness. They were, by every metric the railroad cared to measure, the more reliable workforce. The first Chinese headman recorded in the Central Pacific payroll books was a man named Hung Hua. His name appears on payroll sheet number 26, dated January 1864, alongside a foreman called Ah Toy. Together, they supervised a crew of 23 workers. Hung Hua was not an ordinary laborer. He was a labor contractor, a businessman who had emigrated from southern China and established himself in Auburn, a town in the Sierra foothills at the heart of gold country. He had placed advertisements in the Placer Herald newspaper offering to supply workers to anyone who needed them. When the Central Pacific came looking for labor, Hung Hua was ready. Over the following 5 years, he became the leading Chinese headman on the entire railroad. He managed hundreds, possibly thousands of workers. He handled their pay through the company, organized their living arrangements in the camps, and served as the intermediary between the Chinese workforce and the railroad's white management. He was in his mid-30s during the peak construction years, slightly older than most of his workers, who were in their teens and 20s. He had received some education before emigrating. He had ambition, business sense, and the trust of both sides. But the payroll records that preserve his name also reveal the inequality that defined the enterprise. Chinese workers received roughly $31 per month. They provided their own food and supplies out of that wage. White workers received $35 to $50 per month, and the railroad furnished their board. When you subtracted the cost of food and provisions, the actual gap was even wider than the raw numbers suggest. At the peak of construction, Chinese laborers made up 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce. They did the most dangerous jobs. They were paid the least for doing them. By the summer of 1865, the railroad had pushed 38 miles east of Sacramento and hit its first real obstacle. Bloomer Cut, near the town of Auburn, was a ridge of naturally cemented gravel, so dense that black powder charges barely cracked it. Crews spent over a year with picks, shovels, and blasting powder to carve a cut 800 feet long and 63 feet deep through that ridge. 40,000 cubic yards of material were removed by hand. It was here that Strobridge lost his eye. It was here that the railroad learned what the Sierra Nevada was going to cost. But Bloomer Cut was only the prologue. Cape Horn was the real test. The promontory sits roughly 55 miles east of Sacramento, just past the town of Colfax. It is a massive granite shoulder thrusting out over the North Fork of the American River. The drop from the proposed rail line to the river below was measured at 1,332 feet. The rock face angled at roughly 75 degrees. There was no natural ledge. There was no shelf to build from. The railroad had to create one from nothing, by carving into the face of a granite cliff with hand tools and black powder. The work began in the fall of 1865. James Strobridge put his Chinese crews to work from the top of the promontory and from both horizontal ends of the proposed cut, chipping and drilling downward into the stone. Each hole for each powder charge was drilled by hand. One man held the drill steel steady against the rock. Another man swung an 8-pound sledgehammer. They alternated. Rotate the steel a quarter turn, swing. Rotate, swing. A single hole deep enough to hold a powder charge might take an hour or more to complete. A misplaced hammer blow meant a shattered hand or a broken wrist. The granite dust hung in the air like pale fog and coated everything: the men's clothes, their skin, the insides of their mouths and lungs. Years of breathing that dust would destroy a man's lungs as surely as any disease. The noise was constant and percussive. The ring of steel on granite carried across the canyon and echoed off the far wall. If you stood at the bottom of the American River Gorge and looked up, you would have seen a line of men on a narrow shelf of rock, silhouetted against the sky, swinging hammers in a rhythm that did not stop from dawn until dark. The sound of it, that steady, metallic ringing, was the sound of the railroad being built, 1 inch at a time. The traditional account, recorded on the California State Historical Landmark plaque at the site and repeated across dozens of histories, holds that Chinese workers were lowered from the clifftop in wicker baskets to drill the initial blast holes on the steepest sections of the face. The image has become one of the defining stories of the Transcontinental Railroad. A man sitting in a woven basket, suspended over 1,000 feet of empty air, drilling into granite with a handheld steel, packing the hole with black powder, lighting the fuse, and then hauling himself, or being hauled upward before the charge detonated. Whether every detail of that account matches what a camera would have recorded, no one alive can say with certainty. The story has been told and retold for 160 years, growing more vivid with each generation. But the core reality is beyond dispute. Chinese workers carved a railroad ledge out of a sheer granite cliff face, more than 1,000 feet above a river, using hand drills and explosive powder, with no safety equipment of any kind, at $30 a month. Whatever method they used to reach the rock, the fact that they reached it is not in question. The cut at Cape Horn was completed in May of 1866. But the cut alone did not solve the problem. The granite shelf was not continuous. There were gaps where the canyon was too wide, where the rock fell away too steeply for even a carved ledge to span the distance. Those gaps needed bridges. The trestle at Cape Horn was approximately 1,000 feet long. It was constructed from local Sierra timber, primarily sugar pine and Douglas fir, felled from the forests within sight of the construction site. The design followed the standard railroad trestle pattern of the era. Vertical timber bents, each one a stack of heavy squared logs, rose from the canyon floor or from ledges cut into the granite, supporting the track deck above. The bents were braced with diagonal cross members and bolted together with iron hardware. That iron hardware had been shipped from the eastern United States by sea, around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a voyage of roughly 4 months and 15,000 miles. There was no overland supply route. That was the entire reason the railroad was being built. So the bolts that held the trestle together had traveled 15,000 miles by water to reach a cliff face in California, while the timber they fastened had been cut within a 1/4 mile of where it stood. The rope used for rigging came from New England. The black powder came from the DuPont mills in Delaware. The only things local were the timber itself and the men who shaped it. And those men, most of them Chinese, had crossed their own ocean to be here. Everything that built that bridge had traveled thousands of miles to converge on a single granite ledge above the American River, in a canyon that most Americans would never see and could not have imagined. The vertical bents rose as high as 100 feet in the deepest sections. Each bent had to be perfectly plumb. Each cross brace had to be true. The deck had to be level enough for a locomotive hauling loaded freight cars to cross safely, a total weight that could approach 200 tons. In practice, no locomotive engineer took the Cape Horn trestle at anything faster than a walking pace. The tolerances were measured in inches. The consequences of error were measured in bodies. There were no cranes. There were no power winches. There were no steam-driven pile drivers at these elevations. Timber was hauled into position by teams of men using ropes, block and tackle, and brute strength. Joints were mortised and tenoned by hand with broadaxes and adzes. Each connection had to bear the full load of a passing train. A badly cut joint, a beam that split under stress, a bent even a few degrees off plumb. Any of these could bring the entire structure down. Piles were driven with drop hammers, or simply muscled into place and wedged against the granite. The men who cut those joints worked with the care of craftsmen whose lives depended on the precision of their own hands, because their lives did. And the trestle held. Trains crossed it. The first locomotives inched across at roughly 5 miles per hour, their engineers white-knuckled, watching the timber bents beneath them, listening for the creak or groan that would signal a structural failure. The failure never came. The men who built it understood wood and stone with an intimacy that no textbook could teach. Then came the winter of 1866 to 1867, and the Sierra Nevada tried to bury them all. That winter brought 44 separate storms to the Sierra crest. The snowpack at the summit averaged 18 feet, but drifts in the canyons and ravines reached 40 and 50 feet. Wind drove the powder snow into every gap and hollow. John Gillis, one of the railroad's engineers, wrote afterward that no one could face those storms when they were in earnest. The Chinese workers did not stop. They could not stop. Crocker and Strobridge demanded that tunnel work continue through the winter, regardless of conditions. So the Chinese tunneled under the snow. They carved passageways from their buried camps to the tunnel headings, creating an underground network of corridors and chambers beneath the snowpack. They lived in those corridors for weeks at a time. They ate, slept, and worked in near total darkness, with snow above them and granite below, seeing no sunlight for days on end. Candles and oil lamps provided the only light. The air was thick with the smell of black powder smoke drifting back from the tunnel headings, mixed with the damp cold of packed snow and the smell of cooking rice from buried camp kitchens. The men moved through these snow tunnels like miners underground, bent at the waist, hauling rock and debris in wheelbarrows through passages barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. The sound of their labor echoed through hollow chambers of ice, a muffled percussion of hammers and chisels and the grinding of wheelbarrow wheels on frozen ground. And the avalanches came without warning. Snow on a steep mountainside does not always slide gradually. It fractures. An entire slope can release at once, a wall of snow and ice moving at 60, 80, 100 miles per hour, carrying boulders and shattered trees and anything else in its path. The sound of a Sierra avalanche has been described by survivors as a roar like a freight train, followed by silence. The silence is the worst part. It means everything that was in the path of the slide is now buried. The Dutch Flat Inquirer reported on December 25, 1866, that a gang of Chinese workers had been buried by a snowslide, and 4 or 5 had died before they could be dug out. That was one report from one newspaper covering one slide. There were dozens of slides that winter. Entire work crews were swept off the mountainside without warning, without time to run, without time to shout. At one location near Tunnel Number 9, an avalanche carried an entire camp, shanties, tools, supplies, men, off the mountain and deposited the wreckage 2,000 feet below in the canyon of the American River. 20 men were in the camp. None survived. When the spring thaw came months later, bodies emerged from the melting snowpack, still clutching their tools, frozen in the postures of their final seconds. Some were found standing upright in the ice, as if they had been flash frozen in mid-stride. Others were found in groups, huddled together against the cold they did not know was their last. The recovery crews, many of them Chinese themselves, retrieved the bodies and sent them down the mountain. Chinese tradition required that the dead be returned to their home villages for burial. The bones of many Sierra workers were eventually shipped back to Guangdong province, but many were never found at all. They remain somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, in unmarked places, in soil that has forgotten them. The exact number of Chinese workers who died building the Central Pacific Railroad has never been established. The company kept no systematic death records for its Chinese employees. The names of the dead were, in almost all cases, never written down in any surviving document. Estimates range from several hundred to well over 1,000. Gordon Chang, the Stanford University historian whose work has done more than anyone's to recover the stories of these workers, has described the agonizing difficulty of counting the dead when the dead were never counted to begin with. Their graves, where graves existed, were unmarked. Many bodies were never recovered. If you have been watching this far, you already know that this channel does not rush past the names that history forgot. If this is the kind of story you want told with the weight it deserves, subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. What came next was more trestles. Cape Horn was the most famous, but it was not the only enormous wooden bridge the Central Pacific built in the Sierra Nevada. The railroad required a chain of them, stretching across canyon after canyon, each one an engineering project of staggering ambition. Long Ravine, near the town of Colfax, was a trestle 1,050 feet long and 120 feet tall. It crossed a deep ravine in Placer County, and the photographs taken by Alfred Hart, the railroad's official photographer, show a structure almost too large to believe. Dozens of timber bents rising from the ravine floor, cross-braced into a lattice of wood that looks more like scaffolding for a cathedral than a railroad bridge. A locomotive and its cars appear in some photographs, perched on the track deck, looking impossibly small against the framework of timber beneath. The Long Ravine Trestle became one of the most famous structures on the Central Pacific. Its image was sold as stereoscopic cards across America, giving Easterners their first real understanding of the scale of what was being built in the California mountains. Secret Town, a few miles northeast of Colfax, demanded a trestle 1,100 feet long and 95 feet high. The town had been founded by gold miners who wanted to keep their find quiet, and the name stuck long after the gold ran out. The Secret Town Trestle was the largest wooden structure of its type on the entire Central Pacific line. It was built between 1866 and 1867, while crews were simultaneously fighting the granite at Cape Horn and the snow at the summit. The trestle curved through the canyon, following the natural contour of the terrain, and keeping the track deck level through that curve while spanning 95 feet of open air required precision that bordered on artistry. But wood burns. Locomotive smokestacks threw sparks, and those sparks landed on dry timber. By 1877, the Central Pacific decided the fire risk at Secret Town was too great. Their solution was extraordinary. Rather than replace the trestle with iron or build it anew in fresh timber, they buried it. Chinese laborers spent the summer of 1877 hauling earth from the surrounding mountainside with handcarts and mule teams, dumping load after load into the ravine until the entire 1,100-foot trestle was entombed in compacted fill. The wood is still there, somewhere beneath the earth, beneath the modern Interstate 80 roadbed. You drive over it today and never know. Together, these structures formed a chain of wooden engineering that carried the iron road across a mountain range the entire country had been told was impassable. Cape Horn, Long Ravine, Secret Town, Bloomer Cut, and a dozen smaller trestles and cuts between them. Each one built the same way: local timber, hand tools, black powder, human muscle. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, the Central Pacific met the Union Pacific, and the final spike was driven. The ceremony was elaborate. Leland Stanford, the Central Pacific's president, swung a silver-plated maul at a golden spike and missed. The telegraph operator, anticipating the moment, had already sent the signal. The word went out across the nation. Done. Church bells rang in cities from New York to San Francisco. Cannons were fired. Newspapers printed special editions. A journey that had taken 6 months by wagon or 5 weeks by ship around Cape Horn now took 4 days by rail. But the achievement at Promontory had been preceded by a moment 12 days earlier that deserves its own recognition. On April 28, 1869, Charles Crocker had wagered $10,000 with Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific that his crews could lay 10 miles of track in a single day. The Union Pacific had laid 7.5 miles in one day and considered the record unbreakable. Crocker's Central Pacific crew, composed primarily of Chinese laborers with a squad of 8 Irish rail handlers, began work at 7 in the morning. By 7 that evening, they had laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track. Each rail weighed 560 pounds. 8 men lifted each rail and carried it to its place. The Chinese grading crews had prepared the roadbed ahead of them. It was a feat of coordination and endurance that has never been equaled in railroad history. But at the Golden Spike ceremony 12 days later, there was a conspicuous absence. The Chinese workers who had built the most difficult half of the railroad were not in the official photographs. They were not on the speaker's platform. They were not mentioned in the toasts. The photograph that circled the globe, 2 locomotives nose to nose, white executives shaking hands, white workers crowding the frame, contained not a single Chinese face. They had been there. Hung Hua was almost certainly present. He had been with the railroad from payroll sheet number 26 in January 1864 to this moment, 5 years and 690 miles later. But when the camera was pointed, the Chinese were elsewhere. Whether by their own choice or by someone else's direction, they were not included in the image that defined the achievement they had made possible. The first through train to cross the full Sierra route passed over the Cape Horn trestle at approximately 5 miles per hour. No one fully trusted the wooden structure to hold its speed. The trestle held, as it always had. But wood was understood from the beginning to be a temporary material. By 1898, the original Cape Horn trestle had been replaced with a steel structure. The other major trestles were similarly replaced or buried. The era of the Great Sierra wooden bridges lasted roughly 30 years. In that span, they carried tens of thousands of trains across canyons that had been unbridgeable a generation before. The payroll records of the Central Pacific, held today at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, tell a story the official histories have been reluctant to confront directly. William Chu, whose own grandfather and maternal grandfather both worked on California railroads, spent years studying those records and found that roughly 1,000 Chinese workers are named in the surviving documents, with their wages and occupations listed. 1,000 names out of a workforce that peaked at 15,000. That means 14,000 names are gone. The records are incomplete. Many payroll sheets were lost. Many entries list only a headman's name, followed by the number of days his crew worked, with no individual workers identified. Hung Hua's men, followed by a dollar amount. Who those men were, what villages they came from in Guangdong, whether they had wives or children or parents waiting, whether they survived the tunnels and the avalanches, or did not survive. These are questions the paper cannot answer, because the paper was never asked to hold them. In June of 1867, with the summit tunnels still unfinished and the snow barely melted, 5,000 Chinese workers went on strike. They demanded wages equal to what white workers received. They demanded shorter working hours in the tunnels, where the air was so thick with granite dust and black powder fumes that a man could not see the wall in front of him. They demanded an end to the use of corporal punishment by overseers. The strike lasted 8 days. Crocker broke it by cutting off the food supply to the mountain camps. There was no other source of food at 7,000 feet. The workers went back to the tunnels at the same wages, the same hours, and the same conditions they had struck against. Nothing changed. The bonuses promised for meeting construction deadlines were paid to the executives and the white foremen. The Chinese, whose physical labor had met those deadlines, received their monthly wage and nothing more. And the injustice did not end with the railroad's completion. In 1882, 13 years after the Golden Spike ceremony, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring further Chinese immigration to the United States. The men who had built the railroad were told, in effect, that their country did not want any more people like them. Many of the workers who survived the construction were suddenly without employment when the railroad was finished. 12,000 Chinese laborers, released from the Central Pacific's payroll, scattered across the West. Some drifted into mining towns. Some found work on other railroad lines. Some returned to China. Many simply disappeared from the historical record entirely, their stories ending the same way they had begun, in silence. I have stood at the Cape Horn overlook above the American River Canyon. I have looked down at the drop from the place where the rail line runs, and I have tried to imagine what it felt like to be lowered over that edge with a hand drill and a pouch of black powder. Photographs do not convey the scale. You have to stand there. You have to feel the wind pushing up from the canyon floor. You have to hear the silence that fills the space where 15,000 men once worked and shouted and bled. The granite cuts are still there. If you walk the old grade above the river, you can see the chisel marks in the rock face, the places where hand drills were set and struck, one blow at a time, by men whose names were mostly never recorded. The marks are shallow, no more than an inch or two deep, but they are unmistakable. They are the only writing most of those workers left behind. If this story matters to you, subscribe to this channel. We will keep telling it as long as there are stories left to tell. The original wooden trestle at Cape Horn is gone. Steel replaced it in 1898. The long ravine trestle was replaced. The secret town trestle lies entombed under a century and a half of earthfill and modern highway. Bloomer Cut is still there, still carrying trains through the same 63-foot walls of cemented gravel that took a year and a man's eye to carve. A California State Historical Landmark plaque at Cape Horn commemorates the Chinese workers. It was placed decades after the construction, and it uses language that the railroad executives of 1869 would never have permitted. It says, in part, that the workers are honored for their work ethic and their timely completion of the transcontinental rails. Work ethic. That is the phrase the state of California chose to describe men who tunneled under 50 feet of snow in darkness, who drilled into granite on a cliff face above a 1,300-foot drop, who were paid half wages and denied the bonuses they earned, who struck for equal treatment and were starved back to work, who died in avalanches and were found months later still holding their tools. The story of the Sierra Nevada trestles is not a story about wood and iron and clever engineering. It is a story about what this country was willing to demand from the people it considered disposable. 15,000 men crossed the Pacific Ocean from Guangdong Province to build a railroad through a mountain range that the best engineers in America had declared impassable. They crossed it. They built bridges over canyons that had no visible bottom. They carved shelves from granite with hand chisels. They lived under the snow. They died under the snow. And when it was finished, they were left out of the photograph. The timber they cut has long since rotted or been replaced. The iron they bolted has rusted. The snow that buried them melts every spring and falls again every winter. But the granite holds everything. It holds the chisel marks. It holds the drill holes. It holds the shape of the shelf they carved into the mountain 160 years ago. Granite does not forget. It is the most honest material in the Sierra Nevada because it shows exactly what was done to it, and by implication, what was done to the men who worked it. The chisel marks remain in the granite at Cape Horn. The canyon remains. The river still flows 1,300 feet below the rail line. The same water that was there when Hungwa's crews lowered themselves over the edge, with nothing between them and the riverbed but air, nerve, and a wicker basket. You can stand there today and hear the wind coming up from the American River. It sounds the same as it did in 1866. The granite has not changed. The men who cut it are gone, and most of their names went with them. But the marks they left in the stone are permanent. They carved their presence into the side of a mountain, one hammer strike at a time, and the mountain has not forgotten them, even if the country that brought them here spent 100 years trying to. That is what remains.